You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 290 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Hope everybody enjoyed their Christmas and had a nice time there. There was certainly a lot going on in the news there, and so I unplugged for a couple days, so I had a pre-recorded show on Wednesday's show, but now I want to try to get caught up on all the news and all the things going on. I think it's especially important because little serious stories are getting news coverage right now. Around the holidays, they like to throw an awful lot of fluff in the news. Dogs and sweaters and little kids, what their favorite toy is. And, all these things are, really important to a lot of people. So I don't want to trivialize it too much. But at the same time, there's also this government shutdown going on. And I think this is a little bit more of a manufactured crisis than a real one. Because when we look at the empire, when we look at the spending overseas, the U.S. operations overseas, the government shutdown, the quote unquote shutdown, isn't even a speed bump for what's going on here. So we'll get caught up on all of that on today's show. If you want to share it, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Check out the Libertarian Institute. You can find all my work on that site. The daily news roundup and then the show Foreign Policy Focus are both featured there on the homepage. And the URL there is libertarianinstitute.org. If you want to, help out the show financially, holiday spirit or whatever, Foreign Policy Focus is on patreon.com. I do try to produce a little bit of bonus content. I need to put some more out this week, but if you want to access that, patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus. And thanks for you who take the time to share and donate. I really appreciate it. 2018 has been a very successful year for the show. And, kind of looking back on the year and, the increase in donations that we've seen and, the sharp increase in downloads of the show is really awesome. So, I'll probably say a little bit more, on the year end show I'm going to do coming up here, but I just do want to say I really appreciate everybody who takes the time to either, share, recommend, or donate to the show. So I do think it's worth emphasizing, just a little bit more here, how little this manufactured crisis of the, government shutdown really affects anything. I mean, I'm, still getting my mail. The government is more or less still functioning. If I go speeding down the highway right now, the police are going to pull me over. Bombs are being dropped all over the Middle East. U.S. troops are still deployed everywhere. And the empire continues to function. It's not like the NSA is like, oh shoot, now we can't collect all your data for this week or any of this other kind of stuff. So this is all in play. I do want to, I guess, acknowledge that, the border wall is an important issue, and there are some other important things that are, either approved or, spending cut for within this bill that is important. So, there are reasons, for people to pay attention to. I don't want to trivialize it completely, but when you look at the grand scheme of things, to call it a government shutdown when, it basically just means like national parks are closed, it is very misleading, especially when the U.S. government really consists of the world empire here. And as we're going to see as I go through the show and all the other news, we're still involved in all these wars. And it's not like the U.S. is withdrawing from Syria because, we don't have money for it. All right, so we have some update on this Trump administration stuff. Of course, Mattis gave a resignation letter. Trump initially said that he was retiring and would be out February 28th. After Mattis's resignation letter was published, and I'm assuming that Mattis or some of his people are the ones that made it public, will be out January 1st. And then this guy from Boeing, who I talked about when he first assumed his job, he was like a deputy secretary of the Defense Department. I believe his role involved a lot of weapons procurement. So the former Boeing exec Patrick Shanahan, I believe is his name. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. Now he is just the acting Secretary of Defense, and we don't have Trump's announcement for who he actually plans to nominate for that job. We could hope that's going to be somebody good. Rand Paul has certainly been, on the shows, hitting the pavement for him and, advocating for and supporting his policy here to withdraw, draw down in Afghanistan by 7,000 troops and in Syria withdraw U.S. forces completely. So, good for Iran for doing that, because I don't think our president is a man of like great principle standings. And it's not that he couldn't change his mind on Syria or Afghanistan here. But if there's public support behind him, my guess is that, he's going to be more likely to support it. And Rand Paul going out on, the Sunday morning talk shows, which I do think Trump actually watches and thinks like many Americans, this is an intellectual experience. I think for him, he sees Rand Paul there talking up his moves, and that's probably helpful for him, kind of continuing in that direction and maybe taking more steps there. So no idea who the new defense secretary could be. Two senators, I think, to keep your eyes on, very much on opposite sides. Rand Paul would be a fantastic choice, or somebody like that. And then it could go completely the other way. Tom Cotton, who would be probably the most horrific choice possible, maybe other than like Lindsey Graham or John Bolton. It'll be interesting to see if the Democrats, especially with the, having the House pretty soon, are going to do anything to target Patrick Shanahan for potential corruption here. Just because it does seem to be an easy target. You have this guy who was a weapons exec, I believe, for like 3 decades, now heading the Defense Department. Seems like that kind of thing could be dangerous and an easy target. And, if there is any corruption going on here, hopefully to catch it. North Korea stuff, we continue to have the sanctions presenting a problem in Korean reunification, not just because North Korea is looking for sanctions relief, but because there's kind of these unity projects going on right now between North and South Korea, and the sanctions keep holding it up. This includes building rails connecting the two countries and roads connecting the two countries. So, these are important steps towards peace, having roads and rails and stuff that could go between the two countries. It would greatly increase the economic ties between the two countries. So, if the sanctions could start to be lifted, it may not matter that, North Korea has nuclear weapons pretty soon, because they're just going to be economic partners with the South Koreans, and there would be no reason for war. There are, it seems to be growing voices among the international community. In fact, Russia and China seem to be on board here with easing some sanctions on North Korea. I've talked about this a little bit in the past on the show, but the United States under the Trump administration is waging a pretty brutal sanctions regime against a lot of countries, but including Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. It'll be interesting to see if at any point countries like Russia and China won't do more and more to circumvent U.S. sanctions, and could really just start to limit the effectiveness of those sanctions. The unfortunate thing, I think, when it comes to North Korea in particular, though, is that because South Korea is such a client state of the United States, it'll be hard for them to violate those sanctions and, go about building these roads and rail lines. Although maybe eventually they'll just tell the Americans to screw off. Moon Jae-in will say, yeah, I'm going to build this road, Donald Trump, and what are you going to do? Sanction my country for building a road? I don't think so. Putin has announced that Russia will deploy their Avenger missile in 2019. These are nuclear-capable hypersonic missiles. It's part of Russia's kind of new nuclear armament capabilities that they have coming out, specifically, I think, aimed at eliminating the first strike capabilities that America was moving pretty close to, prior to this announcement. These hypersonic missiles can bypass the American missile defense systems, and then they have other weapons too. I think some like drone submarines and these missiles that are able to kind of like glide around for a while, and potentially a new bomber too. So that they have all kinds of stuff coming out. But I think this is, kind of Putin's attempt to restore nuclear parity. And at least for a time, Russia will probably, maybe at this point, actually has a little bit of a superior nuclear armament to the United States. While the weapons race is going on, if this isn't serious enough to, make people start paying attention and say like, maybe we need to work on nuclear arms reduction and ending this, new war. The United States is set to, I think, spend like $2 trillion on nuclear weapons over the next 20 years or something stupid like that. And so we can't tinker around in these countries like Ukraine and Syria, but yet the U.S. and the UK are sending some more support to the Ukrainian government in Kiev. The United States is giving them an additional $10 million for their navy, while the UK is sending one of their warships into the Black Sea to dock at a Ukrainian port and I guess a show of support. Tensions are pretty hot in Ukraine, it seems right now, and this is just a very dangerous situation. It's right on Russia's doorstep. Russia has now, built and spent a whole bunch of infrastructure in Crimea. There's Russian warplanes in Crimea right now. The Ukrainian government, which I don't see as, being like a stable, level-headed regime, is very unpopular and needs crises to, kind of drive nationalism and support to the central state with upcoming elections. And the United States and the West seems blindly aligned with the government of Peter Poroshenko for absolutely no reason. It's insanity. When you think about that, you have, this despot in Ukraine who, maybe he was kind of sort of not, the worst leader in the world. He's not a Kim Jong-un, but he's certainly been willing to ally with members of neo-Nazi groups and incorporate neo-Nazi militias into his governments and into his armies. And so, this should be a real problem for people, but it's just not in Western countries. They say that we have to stand by Ukraine because Russia is the big evil enemy, even if that means standing by a guy who's standing with Nazis. This should be a real problem, but it's not. All right, so we had this situation in Israel now unfolding over the holidays where Benjamin Netanyahu called for early elections. I think the elections were supposed to happen in September of 2019. They will instead occur in early April of 2019. Netanyahu's coalition government seemed to be falling apart. He lost the support of his defense secretary, Lieberman, and his very right-wing, very militant faction. And then there's 3 corruption scandals going on right now with Netanyahu. And they do seem, to have some legitimacy behind them. And it does seem that there's some potential for Netanyahu to face some repercussions here. So we could see a new leader of Israel within, the coming months here. It does seem right now that Netanyahu is leading in the polls. And then the second coalition here is led by this former Israeli general Benny Gantz. I'm not really don't know anything about him, but I'm sure Mondo Weiss would be, kind of the source to look, and they'll have some profiles on the potential candidates in, these upcoming elections. Over the holidays, we had the president of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, inviting Donald Trump to Turkey at some time in early 2019. I always advocate for talks over anything else, and I don't see anything necessarily wrong with Trump meeting with Erdogan. However, he, is somebody who's grabbed a lot of power in Turkey, especially since this 2016 coup d'etat in the summer there against him, which he was able to survive. And so now he seems to be an even more powerful man in Turkey. Certainly somebody who's rounded up a lot of people, imprisoned a lot of people, kicked a lot of people out of their jobs. Seems to be a lot of unnecessary and political based, detentions. Of course, there's the treatment of the Turkish Kurds as second-class citizens and the extreme oppression of their political movements in Turkey. And so there's reasons, kind of like Israel, to be turned off by a close relationship between the U.S. and Turkey. At the same time, Turkey is a big actor in the Middle East. It seems they have a growing relationship with Iran, especially as, we're deep into a split between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates that kind of resulted in Turkey falling into a little bit more of a economic cooperation agreement with Iran and Qatar. So, these relationships are important, and hopefully this meeting goes well. That being said, I think Erdogan is the kind of despot capable of committing some pretty serious war crimes. And so it's always, important, just like if Trump was meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, Benjamin Netanyahu, or even Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un, that Trump isn't rubber stamping some kind of, war crime by these terrible leaders. Speaking of terrible war crimes by Israel, on Christmas, Israel carried out a couple airstrikes from Lebanese airspace to targets south of Damascus, not very far south of Damascus. People within the city were able to, record and see the airstrikes going off in the missile defense responses. The targets, I guess, were Syrian army weapons depots. Nobody was killed. 3 were injured. The fact that nobody was killed always kind of gives me a thought that, Israel probably previewed these strikes to Russia and maybe had some Russian approval of these strikes. However, recently, especially after the shoot down of a Russian spy plane, I believe Russia had told Israel they weren't allowed to carry out airstrikes in Syria anymore. I didn't see that the Syrian air defense systems actually engaged any of the Israeli targets over Lebanon. However, I think a couple of the missiles that the Israeli jet fighters fired were shot down. Also worth, kind of just taking some time to reflect here that while Syria is a Muslim country, there are Christians in Syria, and the Assad government has certainly played up the treatment of these people in Syria to kind of show the West, hey, and in some ways you could say that this is, slimy propaganda on behalf of the Assad regime. At the same time, he is trying to get the people of the West, I think, to realize that the people of Syria are people too. And so by kind of highlighting, putting Christmas trees in prominent areas around Syria, like in Aleppo, and saying like, hey, look, we celebrate Christmas in Aleppo and Damascus, don't bomb us. It's just a terrible thing for the Israelis to have done here, right? To carry out these airstrikes over a city of people on a day of celebration, even if it's not for all of them or the majority of them. You see from the videos here that there were certainly people, out having a good time, and then you have missiles being shot over the city for really no reason. It's not like Israel is targeting Assad's presidential palace because they feel like Assad has to go, or doing anything to defend Israel. This is just a matter of trying to inflict some harm on the Syrian government to show that they can. We have some news about the U.S. troop withdrawal here. It appears that, there's rebels in central Syria here along the border with Iraq, I believe, at the Al-Tanaf border crossing. And the U.S. has maintained like a 55-kilometer radius around this border crossing and attacking any Syrian or Syrian allied forces that attempt to enter. I believe there's about 1,500 rebels there and 100 or so British and other Western aligned forces at this little base in Al-Tanaf. With the U.S. withdrawal from it, it's going to put the rebels in kind of an awkward position, because what the U.S. has said is that they're going to, bomb within 55 kilometers of this because there's U.S. troops there, and this is, we're not going to let you any closer than that. But once U.S. troops leave, and ideally the U.S. air support does as well, there's going to be nothing to protect these, Syrian rebel fighters. I'm guessing they're kind of the Sunnis, not Kurds, will surrender then to the Syrian Assad government. It seems the Kurds are also reaching out to Russia. So far, from everything I've read, Elijah Manier had a good article in South Front, and then the AP did some reporting on it that the Kurds are reaching out to the Syrian government. So far, they haven't proposed anything that's going to be accepted. I think basically what they're saying is that we don't want to give up any of our autonomy, but we do want your protection, so you could take up all these border positions on the Syrian-Turkish border to make sure Turkish troops don't come across that border. But, I think the Assad government is going to look for the Kurds to give up some autonomy in exchange for the protection. Turkey, for their part, and Donald Trump is also saying this as well, that they're planning on taking up the fight against ISIS. Don't really understand how that's going to work, because a lot of the ISIS pockets in Syria are not along the border with Turkey. And so for Turkey to fight these ISIS pockets, that they would have to either fly over or drive through Syrian Kurdish territory, and I don't think that would go. I think it would lead to fighting. I don't see a deal being worked out here between the Erdogan government and the Syrian Kurds to allow Turkish troops to operate freely in Syrian Kurdish territory. So I have a big question mark is if it's even possible for Turkey to fight against ISIS, and a serious concern that nobody is showing Donald Trump any maps of like kind of the battle lines in Syria and where all these different groups are. And so that way, hopefully, if Donald Trump is looking at maps and isn't asking, well, how the hell are the Turks going to attack ISIS, because they're, Turkey's way up here and ISIS is way down here. There's some concerns there. Let's just say that. Trump also put out a tweet that Saudi Arabia is going to be paying in part for the rebuilding of Syria. Maybe this is part of the whole punishment that Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman are taking for the Khashoggi murder. Trump is going to make them pour millions or billions of dollars into the rebuilding project for Syria, specifically in eastern Syria. I think the fear here is that if the money comes from Saudi Wahhabis, and there are certainly very rich, Saudi Wahhabists who have donated money to different mosque building or, kind of community organizing projects in Muslim countries post U.S. occupation and bombing campaigns. You have, cases like Afghanistan where the money flooded into these, kind of more radical school mosques and helped to, kind of create insurgencies and the kind of jihadist types of people. So, there is some danger here to just having Saudi Arabia pouring this money in. And, it'll be interesting to see if Donald Trump has to go through the UN or anything like that, or if Saudi Arabia is, just allowed to have whoever fund a mosque in this neighborhood and then point at whatever imam they want as, kind of then the voice of that neighborhood. Couple stories out of Afghanistan here. Of course, pretty much everything that's actually going on the ground in Afghanistan is bad news. 43 people were killed when a group of militants who the government is saying is the Taliban, and the Taliban are denying responsibility, broke into a Afghan ministry building. I think it was actually the ministry that provides care for people wounded in terrorist attacks within Afghanistan, and ended up killing 43 people in that attack. It seems that most of the dead were civilians. I guess it could be the Taliban. ISIS also operates in the area. From what I could tell and just generally what I read, ISIS is more interested in the civilian targets in Afghanistan, although there's certainly been a lot of Taliban attacks on civilian areas of the city of Kabul specifically. The attack apparently lasted for like 8 hours or so, which seems crazy. I mean, I guess there's probably hostages here, so that could be part of the reason. But this was in the city, so this should be one of the more armed and reinforced areas. And for these militants to have the run of the place for so long, I'm sure is unsettling to the people of Kabul. We also have the Afghan presidential election that I believe was slated for late April, being delayed 3 months or so, and I think is going to happen in the fall now. This is because there is a lot of speculation that there are problems with the Kabul ballots from the election, I think in October. Those are parliamentary elections, and a lot of the votes there are possibly being invalid. And it has to do with people not using these biometric machines right and everything else like that. The issue here is that no election in Afghanistan has ever not been claimed to be rigged by some candidate or another. And so, it just doesn't seem like the whole democracy voting thing is going to work there. Not to mention, now we live in the age of the Russiagate conspiracy in the United States. So who's not going to say that, somebody's going to complain, oh, our democracy was undermined by an Iranian or an Indian or a Pakistani misinformation or disinformation campaign, right? And so somebody's always going to make up something, to say that the elections are invalid. It doesn't seem, like there's like a deep-seated belief that voting for somebody is actually going to help change the situation in Afghanistan. And the elections just bring a lot of violence. And that's, the saddest part to me, I think, is every time you see that, some people in Kabul were kidnapped and, 4 others exploded when ISIS attacked one of these voter registration facilities, and then realizing that, the votes are going to be contested anyways. And, whatever power sharing agreement is going to be reached, it's probably going to be reached regardless of the election result. In Yemen, the ceasefire apparently is rolling out. The Dutch general that's in charge of, kind of facilitating the ceasefire has visited both Aden and Sana'a. And I believe also today he was at Hadada. And more or less that the ceasefire is generally holding. Who knows if it's going to be expanded to other regions of Yemen, or, if we could finally see some conclusion, to the fighting and the deep conflict there where people are starving every day now because of, the brutal inspections regime that Saudi Arabia puts on the Yemeni imports and the essential blockade of the country. That's just causing a mass amount of starvation. Libya, a couple of interesting stories. The Libyan Coast Guard says 15,000 people have been captured by Libya attempting to escape to Europe in the past year, and then the UN says that number is 29,000. The very unfortunate part is so many of these people end up in these terrible Libyan detention centers where rape, torture, abuse, murder are all rampant. You have stories, I think I talked about this one from BuzzFeed News, where this one poor guy was like tortured and kidnapped like 3 or 4 different times before finally, just returning home to Nigeria. And you have, European countries doing things like funding the Libyan Coast Guard because it prevents some migrants from making it to Europe. But at the same time, the Libyan Coast Guard is run by a bunch of thugs who are going to throw people in these slimy detention centers. Apparently, the Russian government is in contact with Saif al-Islam. This is the son of Gaddafi, I believe the heir apparent to Gaddafi's rule, prior to the U.S. war against him. He is alive somewhere in eastern Libya in hiding. He is apparently wanted by the Hague for war crimes. But Russia is saying that he should be a potential candidate in the upcoming Libyan elections. Many people see him as, being the only possible kind of unifying figure for Libya at this point, and one of the only people that could, just keep the country from either being in a perpetual kind of civil war like Somalia, a failed state situation like that, or, a complete and just different fracturing of the country, breaking into a few different states. To complicate the situation more now in Syria, I read a report from the AP that an attack by some militants from Chad on the forces of General Haftar in eastern Libya. Haftar controls a good portion of the country now, and seems to have, at least up until this point, a pretty unifying control over his area of the country. Whereas, the Tripoli airport keeps shutting down, because different militant groups keep shelling, the runways and stuff there. So, a very dangerous and complicated situation here in Libya. Only getting more difficult, now that you have some cross-border attacks from Chad. Alright, last thing I want to talk about, and I can't get into a lot of details about yet, and I'm guessing more will emerge, and protests are, I find, one of the more difficult things to talk about just because they're so easy, to be either, misled in the media as to what the origins of the protests are, or, for the protests themselves to just kind of be manufactured. It doesn't take much money for people to go stand out in the street and chant things, right? But here we have a case where it does seem like there's some legitimate protesting going on. This sparked some conflicts with the government there. Left, according to Amnesty International, 37 people dead so far. Some journalists apparently went on a 3-day strike in favor of the protests who are demanding the country's leader step down. So as the story unfolds, I'll certainly try to follow it and see what happens here in Sudan. And, if the Sudanese role in the Yemen civil war here, where you have, young Sudanese men being forced to go fight on behalf of Saudi Arabia there, has any role at all in these protests. All right, that's what we'll wrap up for this week. Foreign Policy Focus at libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, minds.com/immersionnews, patreon.com/foreign policy focus, Twitter at KYAAALE, Facebook is Libertarian Union.